Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Coffee and Open Source, a place for us to learn about new open source technologies, meet some great people, and have some fun along the way. I got my coffee ready, and let's get this started. So today, my guest is Shaun Walker. Shaun, do you want to say hello?
Hi, glad to be on the show.
Awesome. So, Shaun, we've done this one before. So, just a full disclosure to everybody out there, this is round two of this recording. We tried to do this probably a month and a half ago, and we were having some audio issues both on Shaun's end and my end. So, we decided to have another round. So, hopefully, the interview will be so much better that people won't even remember the fact that we tried to do this already.
I
Uh,
feel like it could almost be like a test where you ask me the same questions and see if you get consistent answers.
I mean, I'm not going to lie. So I tried to so the audio issues, I tried to repair them, and I don't know enough about audio engineering to attempt to, but I almost probably know the interview verbatim at this point. So um, I will try to not act like I have interviewed you before and listened to it for about 4 hours.
All right, all right.
Cool. So Shaun,
Sounds
do you
good.
want to you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, yeah. So I'm Shaun Walker. I'm currently employed as a technical director and enterprise guildmaster for Cognizant Softvision, where I help our enterprise clients with their digital transformation projects. I guess my claim to fame is that I was the original creator of .NetNuke, which is a popular web content management system slash web framework, which was one of the pioneering open source projects on the Microsoft platform. I'm also the chair of the project committee for the .NET Foundation. And most recently, I've released a new open source project called Oqtane, which is essentially a modular application framework for Blazor.
That sounds super exciting. So I want to talk about Octane, but let's just kind of start from the beginning, right? So,
Okay.
do you remember the first time that you came across open source? Like a lot of people, they have this a very similar story. They got a computer and they mess with it, took it apart 400 times, put it back together. Maybe
Yep.
some of our older guests, they did the whole CDs through the mail thing, or reading books and writing code like that. So how did you get started, or how did
Yeah.
open
So
source first come to you?
Yeah, so I do have a similar story, I guess. And I guess when I got involved with what I would call the early stages of open source, it maybe wasn't open source. It wasn't, I mean, open source existed at that point in time, but I wasn't aware of it. But I mean, this is sort of public domain open source where where I grew up on a farm in the 80s. So that's kind of dating myself. But it was in a very rural area of British Columbia in Canada. And I mean, back in those days, we didn't have internet, of course. My family didn't even have cable. We had telephone, of course, but we were on a party line with a variety of my neighbors, so that was always interesting. Um, my uncle decided to buy a computer in around 1980. I guess he got convinced by a sales guy at Radio Shack that he should have a TRS 80 Model 3 computer to manage the books for his farm. Of course, he really didn't have the desire to learn much about it, and so it became a bit of a boat anchor for him. He gave it to my grandfather, who lived next door to me, and I would go over and visit my grandparents fairly regularly because we lived right next door. And I would sit down in front of the TRS-80 and I would type in source code from the manual. So I mean, that was sort of my first exposure to having source code readily available that as basically a learning tool. A few years after that, my parents bought a Commodore VIC-20. They bought it because we went and visited some other family members. My cousins had one. They were using it to play games on. Um, my parents basically, when they bought the VIC-20, they said, it's okay for you to play games on it, but only if you actually write the games or, create the games yourself. And so, I mean, I spent a lot of time typing in source code listings from the manual that came with the VIC-20. And then later, my parents got me a subscription to a magazine called Compute, which had like extensive source code listings in it, largely for games, but sometimes for other types of applications. And I mean, I realized by typing in the source code that I started to learn how to write applications myself. And so I guess later in the 90s, again, my grandfather always had subscriptions to scientific magazines like Omni or Scientific American. And I remember in particular, one magazine had an article in it at one point about Linux. And it was, an article about Linus Torvalds and how he had created Linux and how it was open source and people were collaborating on it. And I mean, how it was kind of changing the world. And I thought that that was a pretty cool concept. And I mean, thinking back to that, those were sowing some of the early seeds, I guess, of my interest in open source. Um, and then eventually later, of course, actually got involved in real open source when I released .NET Nuke, and that was in late 2002. So I guess I've been involved with open source for, I guess, more than 18 years now, which is seems like an incredibly long time. But I've learned a lot about what open source is all about over that time period.
That's awesome. There's a lot to unpack there. And just so you don't feel too old, so I have interviewed people that have been in the space longer than you. So I interviewed a gentleman who is on the Go programming language design team, and
Oh yeah.
He got started quite a long time ago. He started out in the basically when it wasn't called open source, it was called the Free Software Initiative, right? So
Okay. Yep.
so yeah, so tons of fun stuff to talk about there. So one of the things that you mentioned that I thought was really cool is that, I think your parents told you, oh, you can play games, but you have to build them, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Yep.
I don't know if there was some trickery on your parents' part there to kind of see how interested you actually were in the computer. Um, but it's definitely a very good ploy, right?
Hmm.
I do maybe harken back to that time as like, oh, well, my parents were very smart in, you know, or were they just like, okay, look, we bought this thing, or we have this thing, you're just not gonna stick around on it all day.
Right.
Um, yeah,
Yeah, I thought about that, a lot over the years, and I don't know to this day, whether it was because that, they saw the potential for computers in the future and they thought it would be a good skill for me to learn, or if maybe they were just being cheap and didn't
sure,
want to pay for the games.
yeah,
I know that, I spent a lot of time typing in these code listings to create the games, and then I have two younger brothers, and they never touched a keyboard other than to pick up the joystick, right, and play the
yeah,
games that I had typed in. So they never picked up on anything from the computer, but I learned a lot. So it
yeah.
was a good ploy.
It's I think that's also an interesting point about your siblings, right? Like I see with my own kids, right? They don't need any on ramp to technology. Like I have
Right.
I have a kid who's going to turn 3 in a week or so, and he literally can just pick up any device, and he
Hmm.
just knows the swiping. He knows that, like he just knows. It's just so intuitive
Right.
for him. And
Hmm.
I'm not saying that it was difficult for me to learn touchscreens or anything like that, but I could definitely imagine, like, if you've never seen anything like that before and you're older, right?
Hmm.
It's substantially like, okay, like, all right, everything's so touch sensitive, but it's so natural when you're so young, right? I'd imagine that.
Yep.
I don't know if your siblings are still into computers or they still like playing games or anything like that, but so.
Yeah. I think they're still more into the games side of
Sure.
things.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't think they've ever written software.
Okay.
Yeah, but it is interesting what you say about the younger generations and how they sort of naturally pick up on technology. The one thing that I've noticed though is a lot of them sort of use technology almost like a utensil, like almost like it's like a
Yes.
knife and fork, right? And they don't care about how it actually works internally. They don't care. They just want to use it. So,
That's a good thing that you brought up. I had a colleague that he was having some challenges with his. I think his kid was 8 or 9, and like the internet, right? He
mhm.
was having some challenges because the kid was just always on, right? So but the kid like never actually said the word internet. He would always just say the apps he was using, right? So
Okay.
like
Yep.
no concept of like how the data is getting to the apps, right?
Right.
So the only
Yep.
words that he really understood was Wi-Fi, which was basically the ability to walk around the house not connected
Right.
to anything.
His lifeline.
Yeah, exactly. It's just so funny because I don't know if you've ever run across this, but I've had at least two experiences in my career, like interviewing for jobs, where someone specifically asks me, "Can you explain to a 5-year-old how the internet works?" right? I don't know if you've had
Hmm.
similar really silly programming questions like
Yeah,
that.
I've also done a lot of interviewing, and I sometimes ask a question like, "Can you describe how a database works?"
Yeah,
So
yeah.
yeah,
But like I was thinking it's ever since I've had kids, I think about, well, does a 5-year-old care how the internet works, right? Like,
yeah,
I don't think that IP tables and all that stuff is interesting to children. Um,
no, no,
so a couple of things. So, you mentioned obviously .NET Nuke. We can talk about .NET Nuke in a little bit, right? But did you just gravitate towards the Microsoft and .NET ecosystem pretty quickly? Like once .NET came out, I think it was in 2000 or 2001, right?
yeah,
Before that, they had obviously they had VB and then scripting languages like classic ASP. But did you
yeah.
just gravitate towards those sorts of technologies?
Yeah, I did. Although, so when I started my career, like it was interesting. So I graduated um, from college in late 1992, I guess it was. And so that was just prior to, the internet arriving. And also it was prior to even Windows getting much prominence. And so I came out of college with like sort of DOS based or mainframe based skills and had to quickly, adapt and learn, a bunch of new technology because things changed really rapidly in the mid
Yeah.
90s. But yeah, so initially my first programming job was actually on the VMS operating system on the VAX platform and like digital equipment and writing like financial software applications in VAX Basic. And so and that's of course green screen, very old school mainframe type of technology. And I think it was in around 1997. I went to like a Microsoft Dev Days in Vancouver, and I went to a number of sessions, and I was like blown away by some of the things that were happening in the Microsoft ecosystem, right? Like just how cool and modern some of the new client server applications were, and so that's what sort of convinced me that I needed to make a change. And I actually I actually emailed one of the speakers that was speaking on one of the particular topics at that event, got an interview, got hired, and that's sort of how I got into really quickly made a change into the Microsoft world. And then from there, of course, yeah, I initially was working on desktop applications, and then transitioned into classic ASP, and then jumped to .NET when it became available.
Yeah, I like I'm a bit younger than you, so but I was for whatever reason I just was always like I think my first programming language is a language that nobody's ever heard of called Ada. Um but uh but
Isn't
it
that a
very
very scientific language?
so I remember my professor saying like the largest implementation of that programming language was it runs the subway system or the tram system in France. And I
Wow.
thought that was very interesting, right? I'm like, that's a very odd placement for a programming language like this. Again, very, very easy to learn, like a very, very amazing, in my opinion, introductory language. But
Yeah.
but it also shows that it scales, but I, for whatever reason, just never picked up in, you know, larger things. I think at that point in time, C++ was already there, and people have their particular religious methodologies around C++.
And I think that that's what it is, right? There's a lot of very capable languages and technologies out there, but it's sort of which one gets pushed the most, and then it becomes sort of who's most dogmatic about preaching it to, right? And
Yeah,
saying that it's the best. Those are the ones that typically have obviously last the longest and get
yeah.
develop the largest ecosystem of developers around them.
Yeah, like I also think it really just takes like one or two like quote unquote tech celebrities
Hmm.
to become tech celebrities on the platform, and that's all it really needs, right? Like you can name any programming language and there's a few tech celebrities for it. One
Yep.
thing that I do find very interesting, and I realized this a couple of months ago, is that every like there you can probably count like there's what 6 or 7 like large mainstream programming languages, right? That might even be generous, but like they've all been created by like 3 people.
Yep.
Like like there's and they're all from Denmark, which I also think is very strange. But that's a whole different like I. like I
Yeah.
don't know what it is about Denmark and computer scientists, but there's something. If you want your kid to be a computer scientist, send them to school. And yeah, I
Yeah.
just it's very interesting how coming about of writing soft or writing programming languages is, and how people gravitate towards them or not. Because obviously there's .NET and there's Java, and recently you've had kind of these, I wouldn't call them bespoke, but they're more tactical programming languages, and the reason why they're so popular is because a large software was placed on top of it, like for instance like Golang, right, like Docker,
Yep.
Kubernetes, and some other
Right.
like written in it, right. um,
Yep.
I
Yeah, you
always
need
think
like
it's
at least one really good reference implementation, right, to prove that it's viable.
yeah, exactly. um, and I'm just excited that .NET is still there, because I think I like my first programming language, like I said, was Ada. Oh, not a tangent talking about my first program. My first programming language is Ada, and then I gravitated towards C++ just because of college, and then
Hmm.
I took a C# class, and I was like, okay, this is it, we're done. Like everything is so easy. Like
Yeah.
IntelliSense is great in Visual Studio, and then my first job, I was working on classic ASP, which was very challenging, um, because I was like writing a lot of stuff like in Notepad or like
Yeah.
some like editor of choice. Uh, but
Right.
then
Those typical
obvious,
kind of VB script based kind of,
yeah,
right? Yeah.
super powerful though. Like not having to go through like the developer build loop. I just I felt like
Yep.
I was very successful hacking code together. Don't get me wrong, um, but definitely like felt far faster. And now
Yep.
.NET is here to stay, and I've been .NET. I've played around with a lot of programming languages, but I've always just kind of gravitated to .NET. Um, One of the things that's interesting too about your career in programming languages and technology and open source is like you were able to kind of make a career of sorts out of it, right? Like you create a platform, a very well known platform, and it turned into this thing where I don't know how many employees that .NET Nuke has, but it's substantial, right? Like so when you were building .NET Nuke, did you have a goal of like I want to turn this into a business, or was it very much you saw a gap in kind of the market, and you're like, oh, I bet I could build a platform that fills this gap.
Yeah, I guess so. You're right. I most of my professional career has been linked to open source, but I didn't start off with that in mind. Um, one thing that I've always been really keen on is building frameworks. So, developing methods that make developers more productive, right? So that instead of writing the same boilerplate code over and over again, create things that are reusable. And that's typically what frameworks are. And so that was the idea behind .NET Nuke is, create a reusable web framework that people could use to build custom applications on top of. And then, of course, it had a lot of content management capabilities as well, so they could quickly spin up a website. Um, but yeah, you're right. I mean, I was able to, for a lot of different factors at that point in time, the .NET Nuke project became very popular, and Microsoft was very key in that success, right, by promoting it to .NET developers. And so eventually, then, of course, the business side of it sort of materialized because there was a need for support and consulting services and more features for enterprise clients. And so we were able to successfully raise multiple rounds of venture capital, build out a company. Um, I think at the height, it was about maybe 120, 150 employees or something. Um, and then it sort of went through the whole cycle. I left in 2014, left DNN Corp. And the company was eventually sold to a private equity firm. So I mean, DNN Corp is still around. It's owned by that private equity firm. That PE firm owns a variety of other very large, popular not always open source, but enterprise software. And they provide all of that software through a subscription service. However, on the community side, it's quite interesting. So the private equity firm um, sort of reduced their investment in DNN, and really focused just on basic maintenance. And the community has really picked up and really picked up in terms of maintaining the overall platform. Whereas, like for a number of years, it was really the DNN Corp, the company, and the employees which were maintaining the open source project, and now it's shifted completely over to mostly community that is maintaining that project again. So it's interesting. So it started as like pure open source, and then gravitated towards more vendor-led open source, and then shifted back to community-led open source. So it's quite an interesting case study as far as an open source project is concerned.
Yeah, like so I have a very limited visibility into .NET Nuke or DNN, but one thing that I've definitely noticed is how passionate the community is. Like, there's definitely tons of people that use .NET Nuke. There's lots of, you know, organizations or entities, I guess, that have used .NET Nuke in some capacity, and it's got a huge stream of community contributors, right? So I went and looked randomly at like the GitHub repositories, and there's a lot, right? Lots of contributions, not just by code commits, but issues and pull requests. And
yeah, and well, I think the main thing, like as a platform, it was developed with extensibility in mind. So it allowed third-party developers to build modules, and then many of those were open source. So yes, you'll find a ton of sort of ancillary open source projects that are related to .NET Nuke as well.
Yeah, I had a question about that in general too, right? So when you first started building .NET Nuke, right, uh, and you noticed that people were interested, like people would open up issues, or they would ask you a question or pull a request. Like, what was your immediate kind of response to that? Because one of the things that I'm really curious, especially with maintainers of like larger open source platforms, is like, what is that feeling like when people first come to you, and you kind of become a source of truth for whatever you built?
So if we go back to when .NET Nuke was initially launched, which was I guess early 2003 in reality, um, GitHub wasn't around, so Git wasn't even around. So I mean the types of collaboration that were possible were much different than they are today. There were a few sites like SourceForge and others that provided some of the collaboration tools that would be needed for open source,
Sure.
but it was very different. And so I initially initially much of the activity around DNN happened in the ASP.NET forums. So there was a dedicated forum that Microsoft created where people could ask questions and collaborate, and that's where the majority of the collaboration happened. Um, Most of the software development was done only by a few individuals because there was no concept of submitting a pull request, right? It was much more difficult to take contributions and merge them. So it was really suggest ideas, and then there was sort of a small key group of people that were responsible for actually implementing them. And DNN operated in that manner for quite some time, probably until 2007, 2008, when it became more of a true sort of open source project as we would perceive an open source project to be nowadays. Leveraging some of the broader, more distributed collaboration tools that are available. So it's really changed a lot over time, but it was exciting. I will say, so to answer your question, it was exciting when I realized that there were so many people that were interested in the project that were, collaborating and asking questions in that ASP.NET forum. It was pretty amazing. But it was also exhausting because you had to keep up, right? Because they were, most people were expecting to get answers from, like you said, the source of truth, right? The people who are on the inside of the project. So yeah, it's a lot of work.
Yeah, so as somebody who maintains a not as big open source project, but I have a couple of very passionate users, and so what I've also noticed too about open source, and this isn't a negative, like, and if it comes off as negative, it's not my intention, but a lot of people, they come across something and they're like, oh, like this is almost exactly what I want. Like, if I can just get this one thing I want, like, it would be the most perfect thing ever.
Yep.
So there's recommendations, right?
Hmm.
Which I have no problem with. I've started to go down the route of like I'm welcome to PRs, but obviously, a lot of people don't have the time and the opportunity to learn a code base and do all that sort of stuff. Um, I wanted like, what's your general thought about that, right? Like
Yeah. No.
you start off as like building something, I guess, for yourself and for community, and then there's a couple of I don't want to say bad actors because they're not really bad actors, but there's a couple of folks that they come across your solution and they're like, this is exactly what I need, except this one thing. And then
Right.
that one thing turns into another thing. And then you're almost like you're kind of like doing consulting, right? Almost to an extent,
Yep.
where you spend a lot of your time just adding features that are being requested by the community, which is great. But at the same time, it kind of drives you away from maybe what you had originally intended when you were building the platform.
Yep. No, I've definitely experienced that, and I would say that DNN. The way to avoid that problem is to have a pretty clear vision of what the open source project is intended to be, right from the start, and articulate that vision, right? Like make communicate it as clearly as possible to the community and refer them to that vision, and then they can clearly see like, okay, what they're asking for is outside the bounds of what the expected goals were. I did not do that with DNN, right? So DNN kind of grew amorphically and it went off in a lot of different directions. In the end, I think the end result was still pretty powerful and good, but I mean, along the way there was a lot of challenges, a lot of friction, a lot of conversations that were difficult. With Oqtane, which is my most recent project, I mean, I published a philosophy for Oqtane like right from the start, which is like, this is what it is, this is what it's not, right?
Sure.
If you come to my community, right, and you are asking for certain features which are outside of sort of this core value proposition, you're probably not gonna get those merged. So that's what it really helped. It's interesting though in open source because um, it's in open source projects, and also I've noticed this in foundations. So through my efforts with the .NET Foundation, I, I like to make an analogy that it's almost like in normal life, right? You're out and about, and someone comes up to you and says, "Hey, I don't like that car that you're driving, right? You should drive a different car. And these are the reasons why you should drive a different car." And then some more people gather around and they're like, "Yeah, yeah, your car sucks, you totally need a different car." No one has even bothered to ask you like why you got that car in the first place.
Yeah.
Maybe it's all you could afford. Maybe it met
Yeah.
your lifestyle or your needs, right? So it's like,
That's
so you find yourself defending your position, and it's kind of, when that first happens, you're like, why do I need to defend my position? Right.
yeah. Yeah.
But it happens.
Yeah, no, I want to. So you brought up something that I love to rant about, so we can talk about that in towards the end. I want to talk about Octane, right?
Okay. Yep.
So you kind of alluded to what Octane is at the beginning, and maybe some people would call an individual who builds a very very large, well-known framework and steps away from it to build yet another very very large framework a bit crazy, but
Crazy. Yep.
obviously you like building frameworks. So maybe talk through a little bit about first off what Octane is, maybe with a little bit more detail, and then why you decided to build it.
Okay. Uh, yeah, so obviously I have a lot of experience with building frameworks, and I am very intimately knowledgeable about how DNN was built and what it was built for, which initially it was built to help software developers build web applications in a much more productive way, right? Rather than building a lot of infrastructure from scratch, right? Give them an architecture and some infrastructure that they can use to build on top of, and focus on solving the main business problem that they have in their industry, rather than just building plumbing. And so I did that obviously for many years with DNN. And then when I stepped away from DNN, I actually got more involved in consulting, learned a lot about, some of the more modern ways that software is being built, like single page applications using React or Angular, and typically with a C# kind of web API backend. But and then scaling those out onto larger cloud infrastructures like Microsoft Azure. So there was a lot of cool concepts that were part of DNN, but DNN as a software framework has not evolved. Like it's still, of course, built on .NET framework. It still is largely built on web forms. All very capable technology that's going to be around for a long time, but it doesn't have a lot of the modern characteristics that developers are looking for in building modern applications. And so when Microsoft introduced Blazor, I was really interested in it because it brought back the concept of reusability and components, which were a big part of web forms, but over time the Microsoft ecosystem has kind of migrated away from that to some degree with MVC, and so Blazor brings that back to the forefront, and I could see how using some of the concepts that were part of DNN, but building it on a modern framework like Blazor would be something could be very compelling to software developers. And so that was sort of the genesis of building a proof of concept on Blazor. And yeah, I mean, it turned into obviously an open source project at this point. And it seems to be gathering a fair amount of interest and building a community around it, which is always very exciting.
So, like that's great. Like, so just for everybody aware, Shaun and I have done this interview already. But before I hadn't really taken a look at Octane. And since then, like I like .NET, I love Blazor, so I took a look at Octane. And one of the things that I did see, you mentioned to a little bit earlier, is that you're very, I don't want to say pointed because that's not a fair word, but you're very direct in like what you think Octane should be and what it should be used for. Um, I imagine that's probably a lot from your previous delves into community building or projects built for the community frameworks. That is, um, and I think that's great. I think one of the things that a lot of open source folks they miss is, okay, so what is the end goal here? Like why am I building this? Like a lot of people, like they love to build things for themselves and for others, but they don't have a plan in mind. So they put something together to get some traction, and then they have to play catch up this entire time to either build it that's more scalable or build it that's more customizable or configurable or what have you, right? And I think that's one of the interesting things. I had a question about Blazor, right?
Mhm.
So you
Yeah.
mentioned that you looked at Blazor and you said, "Oh, this is very promising." So you decided to use that technology. Um,
Mhm.
have you noticed, especially as Blazor's become, I don't want to say the word mature because it's so still young, but as it's gotten, I guess, more publicly available for folks, are you seeing that the community pickup of it is substantial? Because from my perspective, like the second Blazor was shown, like 3 or 4 years ago at that conference by Steve Sanderson, like people were immediately like, "I want this right now. Give this to me."
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
Microsoft has like rolled out versions of it with server-side Blazor, and now we have this completely runs in the browser version of Blazor, right? Um, I want to know what your thoughts are about the initial, I guess you could say, vision or not vision, but your visual I guess observation about Blazor, and obviously it came to the decision to use it for Octane.
Right. Right. Uh, where I think where Blazor started, which was this proof of concept that Steve Sanderson put together, it was really focused on the WebAssembly scenario, and that got developers really excited because as soon as you understand what WebAssembly is and the fact that it's available in all modern browsers without a plugin, and that you can run native code in the browser with all the performance benefits of that, that sounds pretty cool. And also the fact that you don't have to context switch between backend code written in C# and JavaScript code, which is what all of the major single page application frameworks like Vue and React and Angular are built on today. So the value proposition is pretty cool. But then the fact that they then envisioned multiple hosting models, right? The ability to reuse those same components by hosting them server side or in WebAssembly, or theoretically in other future hosting models such as Electron or desktop scenarios, is all pretty exciting. So I think, like, I mean, you can, once you get comfortable with the Blazor component model, you can utilize that skill set for a lot of different use cases. And I think that, you know, I don't know. I, I'm seeing a lot of momentum pick up, but it's interesting because these things don't happen overnight. Like
Yeah.
even .NET, the transition to the .NET framework back in 2000. I mean, it took probably 3 or 4 years, even though, you know, it took 3 or 4 years, I think, before, you know, there was a large enough group of developers that were really excited about it. And you've seen the same with .NET Core, right? .NET Core came out in 2015,
Yeah.
and we still have a ton of enterprise clients that haven't made the transition yet.
Yep.
So Blazor, you know, it's still very early in the cycle, but I like, I mean, I can see that the momentum is picking up.
Yeah, like you mentioned, you definitely you. There's a couple of things that I find very interesting about Blazor. One is that whenever somebody comes across it initially, they're like, "Oh, Microsoft already tried this and it failed miserably," right? They bring up Silverlight, right?
Silverlight,
Yeah,
yeah,
right.
yeah.
But the second thing is like people immediately want to equate it to you mentioned single page application frameworks, right? Like your Angular, your React, your Vue, Knockout to some extent. You want like people immediately want to compare it to something, right? And I think that's
Mm-hmm.
what's very interesting, especially as you look at some of the features that are being rolled in to Blazor by the .NET team, is they're trying very tactically to be able to introduce features that are very familiar to people. Like one of the things is like being able to like bundle CSS, right? Like you have a
Mm-hmm.
view, you have a view, and you can actually say, okay, this particular view, this Razor file, uses this particular CSS, and that's
Mm-hmm.
been something that's been very well adopted in the JavaScript framework community for a long time now, right?
Yep.
Like the compartmentalization of things, making things more modular. So I guess my question is, so where do you see Blazor going? Like you mentioned a little bit, like being able to use it on other platforms like Electron and things like that. But obviously, there's going to be a point in time where I don't want Blazor to always be trying to compare itself to JavaScript frameworks because I don't think that's the real value prop. I think the real value prop is that you can write, your front end all the way to your back end or data layer, whatever you want to call that. You can write it all in one language
Mm-hmm.
instead of like just offering up another SPA framework. So I want to know like what your thoughts are like for Blazor long term.
Yeah, no, I think that you're hitting on one of the main value propositions is that you can build full stack applications, which is, I mean, when I look at some of the enterprise single page applications we're building today, you know, we have to have dedicated front end teams that are skilled with very specific JavaScript technologies and then a back end team. And it doesn't seem very efficient.
Yeah,
It would seem like it's much better to be able to have, um, you know, some resources that are capable of working on both the front and back end full
yeah,
stack,
yeah,
which we used to be able to do. So,
yeah,
um, and I think a lot of productivity gains can happen from that, you know, unity between the front and back end, and that, you know, translates itself into real dollars at the end of the
yeah,
day, right? So,
yeah,
and I think that that's where people are going to start to take notice of Blazor soon, especially like you're mentioning like the CSS um, enhancements that are coming. So, you know, in November, .NET 5 ships. There's a ton of great Blazor enhancements that are coming in that release. That'll be, you know, applicable to both server side and WebAssembly. So it's finally reaching the point where, I mean, enterprise companies should be taking a serious look at Blazor for
yeah.
building, you know, especially greenfield applications.
Oh, for sure. I totally agree. Like I've had this conversation. I before I joined Microsoft, I was a consultant too, right? Like it was in like my last year as a consultant. .NET 2 shipped, right? Or .NET Core
Yep.
2, and I was
Yep.
very much like, okay. Like I remember being at Build and seeing the dot. Like I already was familiar with what was coming, but like nobody listened to me because it wasn't announced by Microsoft, right? Even though it was all available on GitHub, and like I went directly to my boss and I was like, we can only sell these kind of projects from now. Like the customer that wants like the .NET 4.5 application written in web forms, we cannot do that work anymore. Like it doesn't make sense for us because we're just going to have to play maintenance mode for forever, right?
Hmm.
And the
Yep.
like eventually there's going to be there's not going to be feature parity. Like somebody's going to see something really really cool on the internet, and we're going to have to tell them, oh, we can't do that on your platform, which is embarrassing for a consultant.
Yep.
I do think one thing that's very interesting, especially when it comes to building out. Um, so it's not as much with WebAssembly Blazor, but with server side Blazor. I don't want to turn this into a thing, but I actually like server side Blazor. Whole different thing. But I love so one thing with the JavaScript frameworks is that like you always end up having two things to maintain, right? Code bases, servers to host the application, and so forth, right? For the most, usually what ends up happening, you have your API
Yep.
somewhere in the world, and then you have your client app somewhere else in the world. You have to
Right.
set up relays between them. But with server side Blazor, it's one server, it's one code base to manage, right? So from a cost perspective and a time perspective, it's substantially better. Obviously with Blazor WebAssembly, that's not very true because there's no server hit. I guess you can in all SPA implementations put the client code on the server code, but I think a lot of people are kind of against that.
Yeah, but regardless of whether you're using server-side Blazor or client or like WebAssembly, you're still using single-page application principles in
Yep.
your architecture. So you're logically at least partitioning your application cleanly between the client and the server. Whether you physically are deploying it that way is it's a different matter, right? That comes down to your hosting model, and I think that that's great, right? So you can build an application and then you can choose what the optimal hosting model is for it.
Yeah. No, and I just think that Blazor is going to continue to get and build momentum, right? When .NET 5 ships, I think people are going to start having this really deep discussion. They're going to look at Blazor WebAssembly and how small it is, right? How fast it is, and they're gonna people are gonna have to make decisions that, okay, do we continue to build these solutions? Oh, in consultants, companies are going to even have a harder time, right? Because not only are you going to have people that are very good with React and Vue and Angular, because customers are always going to want that. They're also going to have their .NET folks like learn Blazor, which I mean, at the end of the day, it's still C#, but there's still a lot of nuances, right, with Blazor um, that is, it's not like building MVC or Razor Pages or even
No,
web form,
it's a
right?
completely different model. Yeah.
Yeah,
So there is a learning curve.
yeah. So, and I think I'm excited to see kind of in the next 2 years, like where Blazor is. Um,
Yeah,
as
and this
long
is
as
also why
yeah,
I felt like I like having some good reference
yeah,
examples, right? Which is like Octane is a great reference example. If you open up the code, you can see how to do a lot of different
yeah,
things in Blazor. And you need those examples to drive adoption.
exactly, right. And I think that the fact that they're all, like I mentioned, the community around Blazor, right? Like the fact that yourself, the fact that there's other folks that's all they focus on is Blazor, right? And they're either live streaming or blogging or throwing stuff out on GitHub constantly because they see all this potential and they don't want to die in the right, which I think is awesome.
Yep.
And I think before we wrap up, I think one thing that I would like to talk with you about kind of is you mentioned the .NET Foundation, right?
Yep.
And the work that you're doing there. Like I'm a .NET Foundation member myself. I pay my dues. I'm also part of the marketing committee.
Yep.
And you know I'd like to know kind of what your your thoughts are about the foundation in general, as well as the work that you're doing on the foundation.
Okay. No, and I have a fairly long history, I guess, with the foundation because when I left DNN Corp in 2014, it was right around the time that the .NET Foundation was just being created. And so I was included in some of the early discussions when it was just being put together. In fact, I was considering um, an opportunity as the executive director of the .NET Foundation in 2014, which ultimately didn't materialize, but I've been involved ever since. And
Yeah.
so initially involved on the advisory council and more recently in the project committee. I mean, originally, because I was also involved in the precursor to the .NET Foundation, which was the Codeplex Foundation. And so, I mean, early on, Microsoft really was interested in moving in the open source direction, but they needed a way that they could allow their employees to collaborate on open source projects and allow the community to also collaborate by making contributions. And they couldn't do that within Microsoft itself. So they needed a separate entity to be able to do that. And so that's what originally the Codeplex Foundation was created for, and then later the .NET Foundation. Since then, I think that the mandate for the foundation has evolved. It's become more and more independent from Microsoft. There's, probably it represents almost all of the largest open source .NET based projects that are available or members of the foundation at this point. And certainly people think that the foundation should be doing more, but that goes back to what I was referencing earlier.
Yeah.
There's a lot of great ideas, a lot of passion in communities. And sometimes, some of these ideas may not be practical or feasible, but sometimes they are. And so, but sometimes the process to arrive at, the implementation of these things is quite painful.
Yeah.
And I wish it didn't have to be that way, but I don't know. I think that the foundation is evolving, and in the most recent years, with a more independent board of directors and with a very, active executive director, I see a lot of positive momentum picking up for the foundation.
Yeah, no, I totally agree, right? And I don't feel it appropriate to stand on my soapbox and talk about what the foundation should and should not do. That's not my place. But I do think that there's tons of opportunity for more community involvement. Like, one of the things that I think that's very well known is that a lot of people, they have this feeling of, what is the .NET Foundation actually doing? Like, what are they doing for me as a member or as a project maintainer or what have you, right? And one of the things, and I'm not trying to advertise something that I did, but I started building out these things called project spotlights, right?
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, where we're going to be doing it once a month. We've already done it for Cake. We have another one coming up probably in the next week or so. We'll be doing it for your alma mater, .NetNuke.
That's good.
And I think that it's an opportunity for people to see, some of the projects that the .NET Foundation sponsors and how they've come about, right? I think one of the things that has gotten me very interested with working with the foundation is that it is complete community. And as somebody that's on one of the committees, like there's one person that's really involved that works for Microsoft, maybe two, right? That are really, work at Microsoft, that are really involved, at least in the community, at least in the community that I work on. And the rest of them are open source people, or they're people that are project maintainers, or they're dues paying members, or whatever, right? And I think that that's how you build great foundations, is by leveraging the community as much as you can. So I think that's my one little soapbox rant is, right, if you don't think the foundation is doing enough, you should help out. But so back to just the foundation and the work that you're doing on the project committee. So what is one of the biggest principles that you think that's beneficial for projects to be on the .NET Foundation, or a part of the .NET?
Yeah, I think it varies from project to project. Some of the .NET Foundation does provide a lot of sort of best practices and infrastructure services to projects. Depending on where they are in their maturity curve, they may already have solutions for some of those problems. In other cases, if they're younger, there's a lot of great services that the foundation provides that they could take advantage of. So I think it varies for each project. I think on just having an affiliation to the .NET Foundation provides some measure of credibility, right? And improves the reputation of the project, or at least it should, because, I think that the foundation wants to be able to stand behind every one of its projects. To say, this is a great solution that you should have no concerns about using. And also the foundation takes responsibility to ensure that the open source license, is never going to become more restrictive. So as a company, if you're going to use those projects, you can be assured that, you're never going to be put in a difficult situation because of licensing. So those are just a few of the things. As a project committee, that's one of our tasks, is to evaluate sort of the list of benefits that we provide today, and brainstorm for new things, new opportunities that we could provide to the community.
Yeah, so I guess I'm curious as to what, like, if you could pick one thing, and it doesn't have to be something that's even feasible, right? As
Mhm.
some, like, and take off your project committee .NET Foundation hat on and put on your, open source project maintainer hat on. Like, what is the one
Yeah.
thing that you think that Oqtane or in the past a .NET Nuke could, it, I guess you could say, take advantage of if it was a part of the foundation that's not currently there?
This is very difficult to achieve, I think, because it's very complicated. But I think what a lot of open source projects struggle with is a sustainable business model. Like, especially once they reach a certain point of popularity, the original maintainers spend so much time just maintaining their project that they can't focus on, traditional um,
Ways of
work, and
making
so that,
money.
yeah, ways of making money. Yeah, so and then they're in a really difficult position, because
Yeah,
then they're forced to make sacrifices on one side or the other, right? Either they have to sacrifice their time to spend on making a living, or sacrifice it to devote to the open source
yeah,
community, which they're not getting paid for. And so if there was some way that the foundation could create a model, either through sponsorship, or tying open source maintainers to donors, or some kind of a system that could help in this way, I think that that would go a long ways. And I don't even know if other open source communities outside of .NET are,
yeah,
have been able to crack this. It's a tough problem.
yeah. Like I equate it to, like that's a very interesting thing. Like I've talked with enough open source maintainers at this point to be like, oh, like there's kind of two types of open source projects, right? There are the ones that eventually get bought or commercialized or servicized or whatever you want to say, and end up being a revenue stream. And then
Hmm.
there's the ones that they really can't because the community would backlash against them.
Yeah,
Or
they're just very hard to commercialize.
yeah, like it's a very bespoke thing. And one
Yeah.
of the things that I've always been challenged with is like how does the latter sustain, right? Like you have like if you're building a very bespoke thing that's not very commercially viable, right? Like but everybody uses it. It's very very hard.
Hmm.
Like I see things like GitHub sponsors as an opportunity to kind of help
Yeah.
that, but GitHub sponsors being like I don't know, I equate it to like beer money. Like give me
Yeah.
throw me some beer money.
Right.
Even though that's not the intention, but I think that there's definitely more that can be done, and I'd be curious to know like what other foundations do because like .NET isn't the only foundation that it does what it does in different spaces, right?
Hmm.
So how do they help basically provide some form of revenue stream right to folks, just so they
Yeah.
can quote unquote keep the lights on or
Right.
enhance it. Um,
And the best form of revenue stream would also be a passive revenue stream, if possible, because you don't you don't want, like, if you want to keep those people focused on delivering the highest value in their open source activities, then they can't be devoting effort elsewhere. You know what I mean?
yeah, yeah,
So
I just figured it out. So every open source maintainer should actually add a Bitcoin miner to their project. So
yeah.
no, hear me out, right? So everybody who uses it has to mine Bitcoin for the open source maintainer. That's genius, right? Like I think anyway. I don't know if there's money in mining Bitcoin anymore. I'm probably not, but that's very passive, right? You're not doing anything. You're just like people just have to clone your repo. Um, so we're about out of time, and I want to say, Shaun, thank you again for being so patient with us here. This is round two. Hopefully, everybody gets an opportunity to watch this one. I feel like we did a pretty good job of making up for lost time.
Last time. Yep.
Yeah. So we, like always on Coffee and Open Source, I want to end with, so one of the things that's prevalent is that when people they have something that comes to mind whenever they think about it, right? So if you could describe open source or your, vision of open source in one word, what would it be?
And I know what my answer was last time, and it hasn't changed. Freedom.
perfect,
And
right?
freedom can mean a lot of different things, but I mean, it comes down to freedom for me with open source.
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of like I haven't gotten a negative one yet. I'm waiting for the one person to be like horrible. But no, I think for the most part, like everything is very equatable, right? There's community, there's collaboration, there's freedom, and I think as we continue to evolve as open source, I hate right, pioneers, right? As long as we continue to contribute to open source, it's the whole cliche standing on the shores of giants, right?
Hmm.
And I want to call out that you are one of those giants, right? Like yeah, right. You're like
Yeah,
but no,
I
but
don't know
like
about that.
yeah, but I think I want to thank you for all the contributions you've done to open source and the ones you're gonna do in the future. So that'll be it for Coffee and Open Source this week. So thank you again, Shaun. Enjoy the rest of your day, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye bye.